The moment Megyn Kelly opened up about what she had heard behind the scenes, the tone of the entire conversation shifted in an instant. What started as a typical political discussion quickly turned into something far more explosive, leaving viewers questioning how much of the story they had actually been hearing was only the surface layer. According to the discussion, there were deeper tensions simmering underneath the public statements, involving powerful figures, donor influence, and internal disagreements that were never meant to be aired so openly. Megyn's remarks didn't just add context, they added pressure to a narrative that already felt fractured, suggesting that what the public sees may be only a carefully managed version of events. As she spoke, reactions began to split almost immediately. Some viewers saw clarity in her words, believing she was finally filling in the missing gaps. Others felt she had opened a door to speculation that could not be easily closed again. And at the center of it all stood one unsettling idea: that behind polished interviews and public unity, there may be a much more complicated reality involving loyalty, influence, and competing agendas. What Megyn Kelly revealed didn't provide final answers, but it did something more powerful. It raised questions that no one in the audience was ready to ignore. To understand why Megyn Kelly's comments hit such a nerve, you have to look at the environment they dropped into. This wasn't a simple interview moment that lived and died in isolation. It landed in the middle of an already tense media ecosystem where personalities, political identities, and long-running rivalries have been colliding for years. In that kind of space, even a small remark doesn't stay small for long. It expands, gets reinterpreted, and quickly becomes part of a much larger narrative battle. Megyn Kelly has spent years building a position for herself as someone willing to step slightly outside institutional lines while still maintaining credibility with mainstream audiences. That positioning matters here because it means anything she says is automatically read through two lenses at once. Some see her as a straight shooter willing to say what others won't, while others see her as someone carefully navigating alliances within the same political ecosystem she critiques. That tension is exactly what makes her commentary so influential and so heavily dissected. In this particular discussion, the focus drifted into a sensitive cluster of personalities and power dynamics within conservative media circles. These aren't just casual public figures having occasional disagreements. They are interconnected voices who share audiences, clash over strategy, and often shape public opinion within the same ideological space. When one of them speaks about another, it doesn't stay personal, it becomes structural. It starts to reflect perceived fractures in the entire movement. Erika, positioned publicly as a grieving widow and organizational figure, has also become a symbolic presence in the broader conversation about legacy and direction. In moments like these, public figures connected to major political identities are rarely viewed as individuals alone. They become representatives of continuity, change, or resistance to change. That is part of why even indirect commentary about her role quickly becomes loaded. People are not just reacting to her as a person, they are reacting to what she represents in a larger ideological story. Then there is the donor layer, which often remains invisible in public-facing discussions, but is frequently referenced in commentary spaces. In political and media ecosystems, funding networks and influential supporters are often perceived as shaping priorities, boundaries, and messaging direction, even when no explicit coordination is ever confirmed. This perception alone is enough to generate ongoing speculation, especially when public messaging appears to shift, or when internal disagreements become visible through interviews and podcasts. Against this backdrop, Megyn Kelly's remarks were interpreted as more than casual observations. They were folded into a long-running pattern of audience suspicion about who influences whom, and how much independence public figures truly have. Once that lens is active, every statement starts to feel like a clue rather than a comment. At the same time, the broader audience itself plays a major role in amplifying these narratives. Modern political media consumption is not passive. Viewers actively analyze tone, wording, omissions, and timing. They connect clips from different interviews, cross-reference past statements, and build their own interpretations of consistency or contradiction. This creates a feedback loop where commentary doesn't just inform the audience. It is reshaped by the audience in real time. The result is a highly charged environment where figures like Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, and others are not simply speaking into a void. They are speaking into an ecosystem that immediately dissects, reframes, and redistributes their words into competing storylines. In such an environment, even a single stunned viewer's moment is not just entertainment framing, it becomes a trigger for broader narrative escalation. This is why the introduction to this controversy cannot be separated from the environment around it. The reactions are not just about what was said, but about what people already believe is happening behind the scenes. Every comment is filtered through existing suspicions, alliances, and ideological expectations. And once that happens, even neutral statements begin to take on explosive meaning. The real tension in this story begins when Megyn Kelly's remarks stop being treated as casual commentary and start being interpreted as a signal. In tightly connected media ecosystems like this one, nothing stays just an opinion for long. Every sentence gets weighed against past interviews, private disagreements that leaked into public view, and long-standing ideological fault lines that were already there beneath the surface. What emerges is not a single controversy, but a chain reaction of overlapping conflicts. At the center of it is a growing perception that there are two competing realities being described at the same time. In one version, everything is stable: public unity, shared goals, and respectful disagreement among allies. In the other version, there are fractures, personal grievances, donor influence, ideological pressure, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering that rarely makes it into official statements. Megyn Kelly's comments are interpreted by some audiences as accidentally pulling back the curtain on that second version, even if she never explicitly frames it that way. The first layer of conflict comes from the reaction inside the audience itself. As clips circulate, viewers begin splitting into camps. One group believes Megyn is being responsible and careful, simply acknowledging complexity in a sensitive environment. The other group sees her remarks as confirmation that there is more happening behind closed doors than is being publicly admitted. This divide is not new, but her comments intensify it because they appear to touch multiple sensitive figures at once. The second layer involves the personalities being discussed. In this broader media ecosystem, figures like Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro are not just commentators, they represent different styles of influence and authority. Candace is often perceived by supporters as someone willing to challenge institutional boundaries directly, while critics see her as intentionally provocative. Ben Shapiro, on the other hand, is often viewed as structured, disciplined, and aligned with more traditional institutional conservative frameworks. When Megyn Kelly's commentary is placed in this context, it begins to feel like she is navigating between two opposing gravitational forces. That is where the first twist begins to form. The conflict is not just ideological disagreement, but competing expectations of loyalty. The tension is less about one specific statement and more about what each side believes others are supposed to say publicly. Once that expectation exists, silence becomes meaningful, hesitation becomes suspicious, and nuance becomes controversial. A key turning point in how the story is interpreted comes from the idea that private conversations may not align with public messaging. Within the commentary ecosystem, this is where narratives become most volatile. Even without confirmed evidence, the suggestion that people are saying one thing in private and another in public is enough to reshape audience perception. It creates a sense that what is visible is only a partial layer of a deeper structure. This is also where donor influence enters the narrative more aggressively. In political and media spaces, donors are often treated not just as financial supporters, but as potential shaping forces behind priorities and messaging boundaries. Whether or not specific claims are verified, the idea of donor pressure is powerful enough to change how audiences interpret behavior. If a figure appears to shift tone, soften language, or avoid certain topics, some viewers will immediately search for an external explanation. Megyn Kelly's remarks are pulled into that interpretive framework almost instantly. The first major twist, then, is not a single revelation, it is the collapse of simplicity. What initially appears to be a straightforward discussion about commentary and disagreement becomes a multi-layered narrative involving loyalty, influence, and perceived control. Each figure is no longer evaluated only on what they say, but on what their words might imply about unseen pressures. As this interpretation spreads, reactions begin to amplify the conflict further. Clips are edited, reposted, and reframed with different emotional angles. Some highlight Megyn Kelly as a voice of clarity, while others frame her as opening doors to speculation that should remain closed. This dual framing ensures that the controversy grows in both directions at once. Admiration and criticism expand simultaneously. At the same time, the audience itself becomes part of the conflict. Online comment sections, reaction videos, and debate threads begin to function like parallel courtrooms where different versions of events are argued, defended, and rejected. In this environment, certainty is rare. Most interpretations are provisional, based on limited information combined with strong prior beliefs. The twist deepens further when viewers start connecting separate conversations into a single storyline. Previous interviews, older disagreements, and unrelated statements are reintroduced as context, even if they were never originally linked. This retroactive pattern building gives the impression of continuity where none may officially exist. But in narrative terms, it creates the feeling that everything is connected, even when evidence is fragmented. By the end of this phase, the story has shifted completely. What began as a discussion about Megyn Kelly's remarks has become a broader narrative about trust inside a political media network. The conflict is no longer just about who said what, it is about who is believed, who is trusted, and who is perceived to be shaping the story behind the story. And that is where the second wave of escalation begins to form. Once audiences believe there is a hidden layer, every new statement is interpreted as either confirmation or concealment. There is no neutral ground left. As the conversation continues to circulate, the tone around Megyn Kelly's comments shifts from analysis to suspicion. What began as interpretation hardens into conviction for some viewers, while others double down on rejecting any deeper reading altogether. This is where the story stops being just about disagreement and starts becoming about competing belief systems. The escalation is driven less by new facts and more by recontextualization. Old interviews are resurfaced and rewatched with new assumptions. A casual remark from months earlier is now treated as evidence of intent. A pause in speech becomes meaningful. A careful choice of wording is treated like a coded signal. In this environment, nothing exists in isolation anymore. Megyn Kelly's remarks about internal pressures and donor influence are now being pulled into a much larger narrative frame. For some viewers, they confirm a long-held belief that media ecosystems are not purely driven by public-facing ideas, but also by invisible networks of funding, loyalty, and strategic alignment. Even though these dynamics are common in political media broadly, the intensity of the reaction here comes from how directly it is being applied to specific personalities that audiences already feel emotionally invested in. This is where the shocking reveal effect begins to form, not as a single disclosed secret, but as a perceived unveiling of structure. Viewers begin to believe they are seeing how the system actually works, even if what they are seeing is still fragmented commentary. Once that perception takes hold, every new detail feels like confirmation. Within this escalation phase, Erika becomes a symbolic focal point, rather than just a referenced individual. In the public imagination forming around this discourse, she is no longer seen only through the lens of personal grief or organizational continuity. Instead, she is interpreted as a figure positioned at the intersection of legacy, messaging, and institutional direction. That shift in perception is what fuels much of the tension. People begin asking not just what she says publicly, but what her role represents in the broader alignment of power and narrative. At the same time, Candace Owens is increasingly framed by segments of the audience as someone pushing against institutional boundaries. Whether one agrees with her or not, her presence in the discussion is interpreted as disruptive to established messaging lines. This reinforces the sense of internal fracture. In narrative terms, she becomes a counterforce to perceived control structures, which intensifies the polarity of audience reactions. Megyn Kelly's position becomes more complicated at this stage. Instead of being viewed simply as a commentator, she is increasingly treated as someone navigating between competing pressures. Some audiences interpret her cautious framing as evidence that she is aware of sensitivities that are not publicly visible. Others argue she is being overly careful and avoiding direct confrontation. Either way, her neutrality is no longer seen as neutral. It is now read as meaningful behavior in itself. The escalation also comes from how audiences begin layering unrelated events into a single storyline. A separate interview clip mentioning donor expectations is now placed alongside Megyn Kelly's remarks. Another discussion about ideological differences is added into the same framework. Over time, these pieces form a composite narrative that feels coherent to those consuming it, even if the original contexts were distinct. This is where the shock element intensifies, not because a single new fact has emerged, but because the audience begins to feel they are connecting dots that were previously invisible. That sense of discovery is powerful. It creates emotional momentum, even in the absence of verified new information. People feel as though they are uncovering something that was always there but never fully acknowledged. At the same time, pushback increases sharply. Critics of this interpretation argue that the narrative is overextended, that it relies too heavily on inference and emotional reading, rather than confirmed detail. This resistance only fuels the escalation further, because disagreement in such environments often strengthens conviction on both sides. Each group becomes more certain as the other group challenges them. A key moment in this phase is the reframing of silence. Where earlier in the narrative silence was simply absence, it is now treated as strategy. When certain figures do not directly address specific claims, audiences interpret that absence in multiple ways. Some see it as restraint, others see it as avoidance. This dual interpretation ensures that ambiguity itself becomes part of the controversy. The shocking reveal, therefore, is not a single statement or confession. It is the moment the audience collectively reinterprets the entire situation as something larger than individual remarks. Megyn Kelly's comments become a trigger point for a wider belief that internal divisions, donor influence, and ideological shifts are all interconnected in a way that has not been publicly acknowledged in full. By the end of this escalation phase, the narrative has fully transformed. It is no longer about one interview or one reaction. It has become a layered story about trust, influence, and competing interpretations of truth inside a high-profile media ecosystem. And once that transformation is complete, the next stage naturally follows: how the public and industry respond when a narrative stops being contained and starts becoming self-sustaining. As the clip spreads further, the reaction cycle shifts into full public mode. What had started as a focused commentary moment inside a single interview quickly expands into a wider media event, with audiences, commentators, and industry figures all layering their own interpretations on top of Megyn Kelly's remarks. At this stage, the story is no longer controlled by any single voice. It is being rebuilt continuously by whoever is reacting to it. The first wave of reaction comes from viewers who encounter the clip in isolation. Short-form edits strip away context, leaving only the most emotionally charged segments. For these viewers, the tone of the discussion feels more intense than the original interview likely intended. Without the gradual buildup, the remarks appear sharper, more definitive, and more controversial. This leads to immediate polarization. Some interpret it as a brave moment of honesty, while others see it as reckless speculation about sensitive internal dynamics. Almost instantly, commentary accounts begin framing the situation in competing ways. One side emphasizes Megyn Kelly's willingness to engage with uncomfortable topics, positioning her as someone who is not afraid to acknowledge complexity within politically sensitive environments. These interpretations highlight her tone as measured and her approach as cautious but deliberate. In contrast, critics argue that even raising certain implications in a public forum risks inflaming narratives that are already highly sensitive and emotionally charged. Within media circles, the reaction becomes more strategic. Pundit-style commentary begins focusing less on the specific content of Megyn's remarks and more on what her framing represents. Some see it as evidence of increasing fractures within conservative media ecosystems, where internal disagreements are no longer contained behind the scenes. Others treat it as a reflection of how modern political commentary increasingly blends analysis with narrative storytelling, blurring the line between reporting and interpretation. Industry reactions also reflect underlying competitive dynamics. Media figures who share overlapping audiences are often incentivized, directly or indirectly, to respond to viral moments like this. That creates a secondary layer of commentary, where the original discussion becomes a reference point for broader positioning. In this case, Megyn Kelly's remarks are not just being analyzed, they are being used as material for larger debates about credibility, influence, and ideological consistency within political media. Meanwhile, social media platforms amplify emotional responses more than analytical ones. Posts that frame the situation as exposing something hidden, or confirming behind-the-scenes pressure, tend to circulate faster than nuanced breakdowns. This acceleration effect reinforces the perception that the story is more significant than a single interview moment. As engagement grows, so does the incentive for creators to emphasize the most dramatic interpretation available. Another key layer of reaction comes from audiences already deeply invested in the personalities referenced in the discussion. For these viewers, the clip is not just content. It is part of an ongoing narrative they have been following for months or even years. As a result, their reactions are shaped less by what was newly said and more by how it fits into their existing understanding of relationships, alliances, and ideological positions. This is why the same clip can produce completely opposite conclusions depending on prior beliefs. Inside this environment, Erika becomes a particularly sensitive reference point. Public reactions to her are filtered through multiple lenses at once: personal sympathy, organizational expectations, and symbolic interpretation of legacy. As commentary spreads, she is discussed less as an individual and more as a representation of continuity, transition, and institutional identity. That symbolic framing increases emotional intensity around any mention of her role. Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro, meanwhile, are used as shorthand for broader ideological tension within the ecosystem. In public reactions, they are often less discussed as individuals and more as contrasting poles of style and influence. This simplifies the narrative in a way that makes it easier to share and debate, even if it flattens the complexity of their actual positions. Megyn Kelly's own response, or lack of direct follow-up statements in some interpretations, becomes part of the reaction itself. Supporters argue that her restraint reflects professionalism and awareness of the sensitivity of the subject matter. Critics argue that it leaves too much open to interpretation, allowing speculation to grow unchecked. In both cases, her position is strengthened as a focal point of discussion rather than diminished by it. As the industry reacts, a familiar pattern emerges: commentary about commentary. Instead of directly addressing the underlying issues raised in the original discussion, much of the discourse shifts toward analyzing why the discussion is happening at all. This meta layer of reaction is what keeps the story alive long after the initial clip has peaked in visibility. By the end of this phase, the public and industry response has fully transformed the moment into something larger than itself. What began as a single interview segment is now a multi-threaded conversation involving identity, influence, and media structure. Every participant, whether supporter, critic, or neutral observer, has contributed to expanding the narrative boundary. And once that boundary expands, the final stage becomes inevitable. Audiences begin searching for closure, for a definitive interpretation that can resolve the tension. But in stories like this, closure rarely arrives cleanly. Instead, it comes in the form of a final twist that reframes everything once more, leaving the audience with more questions than answers. As the conversation reaches its final stretch, the tone shifts again, but not toward resolution. Instead, it moves into uncertainty. The more people try to pin down a single explanation for what Megyn Kelly's comments really meant, the more fragmented the interpretations become. What was once a viral interview moment has now evolved into a layered narrative where every answer seems to create two new questions. The so-called final twist doesn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrives as a gradual realization among viewers that there may not be a single, unified version of the story at all. Instead, there are multiple overlapping perspectives, each one shaped by different priorities, loyalties, and assumptions about how media ecosystems operate behind the scenes. And once that idea takes hold, the entire controversy changes shape again. Some viewers begin to reframe Megyn Kelly not as someone exposing hidden truths, but as someone navigating them carefully without ever fully stepping into one side. In this interpretation, her comments are seen less as a disclosure and more as a balancing act. Every word is weighed, every omission noticed, every carefully chosen phrase interpreted as part of a broader effort to maintain credibility, while not fully alienating any faction within the ecosystem she is speaking about. At the same time, another segment of the audience doubles down on the opposite interpretation. For them, the lack of clarity is itself the point. They argue that the ambiguity surrounding donor influence, internal disagreements, and ideological tension is exactly what keeps the system functioning without accountability. In this reading, the twist is not what was said, but what was never directly addressed. Erika Kirk remains a central symbolic figure in this final stage, but her role becomes even more abstract. Instead of being discussed in terms of specific actions or statements, she is now interpreted as representing continuity under pressure. To some viewers, she symbolizes the effort to maintain unity in the face of competing expectations. To others, she represents how narratives can shift depending on who is speaking and what version of events is being emphasized. Candace Owens, meanwhile, becomes the embodiment of unresolved tension in the narrative. Her presence in the story is less about individual claims and more about the broader idea of challenge and disruption. Whether people agree with her or not, she functions in the discourse as a reference point for questioning official narratives and pushing against institutional boundaries. That role ensures she remains central to interpretation, even when she is not directly part of the moment being discussed. Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, by contrast, are used by audiences as contrasting symbols of structure and independence within the same ideological space. Their inclusion in the broader narrative is less about specific interactions and more about what they represent in terms of influence, alignment, and authority. This symbolic layering is part of what keeps the story open-ended, because it is no longer about individuals alone, but about what each individual represents within a larger system. As the final twist settles in, another subtle shift happens. The audience itself becomes part of the story. People are no longer just reacting to Megyn Kelly's comments or the surrounding controversy. They are actively shaping what the controversy means. Every comment thread, every analysis video, every debate adds another layer of interpretation. And with each layer, the original moment becomes harder to isolate. This is where the cliffhanger begins to form. Not in the sense of a new event, but in the sense of unresolved momentum. The audience is left in a state where the narrative feels incomplete, but no clear next step is visible. Questions remain open. Was this a moment of transparency or strategic caution? Was it a glimpse into internal tension, or just commentary being overinterpreted by an already divided audience? The final implication is deliberately unstable. If there is no single authoritative version of events, then the story does not end. It continues evolving every time it is discussed. And that is what gives this narrative its lasting power. It does not depend on closure. It depends on continued interpretation. As the video winds down, the tone reinforces that uncertainty. Viewers are not offered a definitive conclusion, only a reflection of the competing possibilities they have just seen unfold. The story does not resolve itself neatly because the underlying conflict it explores, trust, influence, perception, and narrative control, does not resolve neatly in real life either. And so the cliffhanger remains exactly where it started, in the space between what was said publicly, what is believed privately, and what may never be fully confirmed. At this point, the story isn't just about Megyn Kelly, Erika, Candace, or donors anymore. It's about how quickly narratives form, shift, and explode in today's media landscape. One interview clip, one podcast moment, or one offhand remark can turn into a full-blown internet debate within hours. And what makes this situation even more intense is how divided the audience has become. Some viewers believe Megyn Kelly is simply doing what good journalists do, asking questions, connecting dots, and refusing to ignore inconsistencies. Others think she's stepping too far into speculation that should remain private or unconfirmed. Meanwhile, supporters of Candace Owens argue she's the only one openly challenging powerful structures without fear of consequences. On the other side, critics say her approach fuels unnecessary conflict and speculation. And in the middle of it all sits Erika, whose silence and selective public appearances have become their own kind of statement, whether intentional or not. This is why the conversation isn't slowing down. Every new clip, every repost, every comment adds another layer of interpretation. People aren't just watching events anymore. They're actively building their own versions of what they think is happening. But here's the real question viewers are left with. In a world where everyone has a platform, who is actually telling the full story? And who is only revealing the parts that fit their side? There are no easy answers here. Only perspectives, interpretations, and a growing amount of noise competing for attention. And that's exactly why this discussion keeps spreading, because people don't just want headlines, they want clarity. So now it's your turn. Do you think Megyn Kelly is uncovering uncomfortable truths others are avoiding? Or is this entire narrative being stretched beyond what the facts can actually support? Drop your thoughts, challenge the assumptions, and join the discussion. Because stories like this don't end when the video stops. They continue in the comments, in debates, and in the way people choose to see the world next.